In the scorching heat of a Persian summer, on a dusty plain near the ancient city of Gaugamela, the fate of civilization itself hung in the balance. Two armies faced each other across the shimmering desert, their banners snapping in the wind like the wings of predatory birds. On one side stood the greatest empire the world had ever known, its ranks stretching beyond the horizon, a sea of glinting bronze and steel that seemed to swallow the very earth. On the other stood a young Macedonian king, barely 25 years old, with an army so outnumbered that victory seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. What happened next would shatter the ancient world like glass, sending shockwaves across 3 continents that are still felt today. This wasn't just another battle. This was the moment when the unstoppable force of Persian might meet the immovable object of Macedonian genius, and the collision would rewrite history itself. The year was 331 BCE, and Alexander the Great was about to prove that sometimes the most shocking victories come not from overwhelming force, but from the audacity to attempt the impossible. To understand the magnitude of what Alexander achieved at Gaugamela, you have to grasp just how desperate his situation had become. He was thousands of miles from home, deep in enemy territory, with supply lines stretched thinner than spider silk. Behind him lay a trail of conquered cities, but ahead loomed the full fury of the Persian Empire, awakened at last from its Darius III. King III had finally decided to crush this upstart Macedonian once and for all, and he brought with him an army that defied comprehension. Ancient sources speak of numbers that border on the mythical. Some claimed Darius commanded over 1 million men, though modern historians place the figure closer to 250,000. Even at the conservative estimate, Alexander faced odds of nearly 5 to 1. The Persian host was a tapestry woven from the far corners of the known world. Scythian horse archers from the steppes, their bows singing death songs across the plains. Bactrian cavalry in scale armor that caught the sun like dragon skin. Indian war elephants, living siege engines that could trample entire formations underfoot. Greek mercenaries, ironically fighting against the very homeland that had birthed them. At the center of this magnificent terror stood Darius himself, resplendent in his golden chariot, surrounded by the immortals, the elite guard whose ranks were always kept at exactly 10,000 strong. These were not mere soldiers, but the embodiment of Persian power, warriors who had never known defeat, who served an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. Against this overwhelming tide stood Alexander's army of perhaps 50,000 souls. They were battle-hardened veterans, certainly men who had followed their king from the shores of Macedonia to the heart of Asia. But they were still just men, flesh and blood, far from home and facing annihilation. The smart play would have been retreat, negotiation, perhaps even surrender. Darius had already offered Alexander terms that would make him one of the richest men alive, recognition as an equal, and all the territory he had already conquered. But Alexander wasn't interested in being smart. He was interested in being legendary. The Macedonian king had not arrived at this moment by accident. His path to Gaugamela had been carved through 2 previous victories that had already shaken the foundations of the Persian Empire. The first had come at the Granicus River, where Alexander had announced his presence in Asia with typical flair, charging across a defended river, crossing in a move so reckless it bordered on suicidal. The Persian satraps, regional governors who ruled like kings in their own right, had gathered to crush this invasion before it could take root. They chose their ground well, positioning their forces on the far bank of the steep-sided Granicus, turning the river into a moat that should have been impassable. Alexander looked at this natural fortress and saw not an obstacle but an opportunity. While his generals urged caution, the young king spurred his horse forward, plunging into the churning waters at the head of his elite companion cavalry. What followed was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. The Persians, expecting a cautious approach, were caught off guard by the sheer audacity of a frontal assault. Alexander himself was nearly killed in the melee, his helmet split by a Persian axe, saved only by the timely intervention of his bodyguard. But the shock of his personal charge shattered the Persian line like a hammer blow to crystal. The victory at Granicus was more than tactical. It was psychological. Alexander had proven that Persian forces could be beaten, that the empire's reputation for invincibility was built on sand. Cities across Asia Minor threw open their gates rather than face the wrath of this young conqueror. The Persian treasury began to bleed gold as tribute flowed into Macedonian coffers, funding an invasion that had started on borrowed money and desperate hopes. But if Granicus was Alexander's announcement, the Battle of Issus was his declaration of war against the very concept of Persian supremacy. Darius himself had taken the field this time, marching north with an army that dwarfed anything Alexander had yet faced. The Persian king was no fool. He had learned from the disaster at Granicus and chose his ground carefully, seeking to use his numerical advantage to surround and destroy the Macedonian force. Yet in trying to outmaneuver Alexander, Darius made a crucial error. He positioned his vast army in the narrow coastal plain near Issus, where his superior numbers became a liability rather than an asset. The mountains hemmed him in on one side, the sea on the other, creating a battlefield where only a fraction of his forces could engage at any given time. It was like trying to pour an ocean through a funnel. Alexander recognized the opportunity instantly. This was not just a battle to be won, but a trap to be sprung. He arranged his forces with the precision of a master craftsman, placing his phalanx, that forest of 18-foot sarissa spears, in the center to hold the line. On the right, he positioned himself with the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen who formed the hammer to the phalanx's anvil. The left wing, traditionally the position of honor, went to Parmenion, his most trusted general, a grizzled veteran who had served Alexander's father and understood the delicate art of coordinated warfare. The battle itself unfolded like a deadly dance. Darius, perhaps seeking to end the campaign with a single decisive blow, ordered a massive assault on the Macedonian left, where Parmenion's forces bent but did not break under the pressure. Meanwhile, Alexander launched his own assault, not at the strongest point of the Persian line, but at its most crucial, the center where Darius himself commanded from his ornate chariot. The young Macedonian king charged through a gap in the enemy formation, his lance leveled directly at the heart of Persian power. For a moment, that lasted an eternity. The two kings faced each other across a few yards of blood-soaked earth. Darius, resplendent in royal purple and gold, the heir to Cyrus and Xerxes, master of 20 nations. Alexander, mud-spattered and fierce, leading from the front like a hero from the age of legends. The collision, when it came, was not just between two armies, but between two visions of the world. Darius blinked first. Seeing Alexander driving toward him like an avenging god, the Persian king turned his chariot and fled the field. The sight of their monarch in retreat broke the spirit of the Persian army like a dam bursting. What had been an organized battle line dissolved into chaos as units tried to follow their fleeing king or were trampled by their own retreating comrades. The victory at Issus was total, devastating, and personal. Alexander captured Darius's entire family, his wife, his daughters, his mother, treating them with respect even as he used them as pawns in the greater game. More importantly, he had broken the myth of Persian invincibility. Darius was no longer the king of kings, master of the world. He was just another opponent, and one who had shown his back to the enemy. But even as Alexander savored his triumph at Issus, he knew the real test still lay ahead. Darius had fled, yes, but the Persian Empire was far from broken. Like a wounded giant, it was gathering its strength for one final, apocalyptic confrontation. The great king retreated deep into his realm, beyond the Euphrates, beyond the Tigris, to the very heart of Mesopotamia where civilization itself had been born. There, on the endless plains where the first cities had risen from dust, he would make his stand. For 2 years, both kings prepared for what everyone understood would be the decisive battle. Darius stripped his empire bare, calling in troops from every corner of his domain. From the snow-capped mountains of the Hindu Kush came the Bactrian cavalry, horsemen so skilled they could loose arrows while hanging from their saddles at full gallop. The Scythians rode down from the steppes, their faces painted for war, their horses bred for endurance across the endless grasslands. Indian war elephants, those living fortresses of hide and tusk, made the long march westward, their handlers carrying the ancient secrets of controlling these beasts in battle. But perhaps most shocking of all were the new weapons Darius unveiled. Scythed chariots, their wheels fitted with curved blades designed to mow down infantry like wheat before the harvest. These were not the ceremonial vehicles of kings, but machines of war, built for one purpose: to break the Macedonian phalanx that had proven so devastatingly effective. Persian engineers had studied the defeats at Granicus and Issus, learning from failure with the cold precision of men who knew their empire's survival depended on innovation. The Persians even prepared the battlefield itself. On the plains near Gaugamela, they leveled the ground, removing every stone, every bump that might impede their cavalry or chariots. They turned the earth into a killing floor, smooth as a marble palace, perfect for the kind of sweeping charges that had once made Persian armies the terror of the ancient world. This would be no repeat of Issus, where terrain had favored the smaller force. Here, on ground of his own choosing, Darius would unleash the full fury of his empire. Alexander, meanwhile, faced problems that would have broken a lesser commander. His army was thousands of miles from home, their supply lines stretched beyond any reasonable limit. Many of his men had been campaigning for years, their armor patched and repatched, their weapons worn thin by countless battles. Desertion was a constant threat, and even among his most loyal officers, whispers began to circulate about the wisdom of pushing deeper into the Persian heartland. The young king's response was characteristically audacious. Rather than retreat to more defensible positions, he advanced toward the very heart of enemy territory. He knew that hesitation would be fatal, that his only chance lay in maintaining the momentum that had carried him this far. Like a gambler pushing all his chips to the center of the table, Alexander committed everything to one final roll of the dice. The intelligence reports that reached him as he approached Gaugamela must have been sobering. Persian numbers were beyond anything he had faced before, a host so vast it took hours just to march past a single point. Yet Alexander showed no sign of doubt, no trace of the fear that must have gnawed at him in the quiet hours before dawn. Instead, he threw himself into preparation with the intensity of a man who understood that perfection was the only path to survival. He drilled his troops relentlessly, not just in the basic movements they had practiced 1,000 times, but in new formations designed specifically for the battle to come. The traditional phalanx was adapted, made more flexible, able to respond to threats from multiple directions simultaneously. His cavalry trained in complex maneuvers that would allow them to strike like lightning, then withdraw before the enemy could respond. Every unit, from the elite companions to the humble slingers, rehearsed their role until it became second nature. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander worked on the minds of his men. He understood that battles are won as much by will as by weapons, that an army's spirit could be more valuable than its steel. In the evenings, he would walk among the campfires, sharing meals with common soldiers, listening to their fears, telling stories of past victories. He reminded them of the treasures they had won, the cities that had surrendered at their approach, the legends they were already becoming. On the night before the battle, as both armies lay encamped within sight of each other, Alexander made a decision that revealed the depth of his confidence. While Darius kept his forces in battle formation, expecting a night attack, the Macedonian king ordered his men to rest. He wanted them fresh for the coming struggle, their minds clear and their reflexes sharp. It was a calculated risk that spoke to his understanding of warfare's psychological dimension. As dawn broke over the plains of Gaugamela, the two armies began their final preparations. The Persian host spread across the horizon like a living tapestry, banners of 100 nations fluttering in the morning breeze. The sound of their war drums rolled across the plain like thunder, while the trumpeting of elephants and the neighing of thousands of horses created a symphony of anticipated violence. The Macedonians formed their lines with practiced efficiency, but even their veterans must have felt their hearts skip as they gazed upon the enemy host. This was not just an army, but a migration of nations, a force that seemed to stretch beyond the very edges of the world. Yet Alexander rode before them, his golden armor catching the first rays of sun, his voice carrying clearly across the ranks as he delivered words that would echo through history. The speech Alexander delivered that morning was not the flowery rhetoric of politicians or the empty promises of desperate commanders. It was the stark truth spoken by a man who had already led these soldiers through the fires of a dozen battles and emerged victorious each time. He reminded them of the gold that filled their wagons, the slaves who would make them rich, the cities that would bow before their names. But more than that, he reminded them of who they were: Macedonians, heirs to a warrior tradition that stretched back to the heroes of legend. Today, his voice rang out across the silent ranks, We face not just an army, but the accumulated power of centuries. Every nation that has ever knelt before Persian gold stands against us. Every warrior who has ever trembled at the mention of the great king's name has come to witness our destruction. The pause that followed was pregnant with tension, the only sound the whisper of wind across bronze and steel. Let them come. Let them see what Macedonians do to those who mistake numbers for courage. As the sun climbed higher, the two armies began their deadly ballet. Darius, magnificent in his golden chariot, took position at the center of his vast line, surrounded by the cream of Persian nobility. To his left stretched the Bactrian cavalry under Bessus, their horses dancing with nervous energy, their riders' faces hidden behind masks of beaten gold. On the right, Mazaeus commanded a host that included Armenian lances and Cappadocian heavy cavalry, men whose ancestors had conquered nations while the Greeks still lived in mud huts. But it was the scythed chariots that drew the most attention, gleaming instruments of death positioned for maximum psychological impact. Their bronze blades caught the morning light like mirrors, each one a promise of carnage to come. The Persian engineers had calculated their effect down to the last detail. These machines would not just kill Macedonian soldiers, they would shatter their formations, create gaps that the following cavalry could exploit. It was innovation born of desperation, but innovation nonetheless. Alexander studied the enemy deployment with the cold eye of a master tactician. He saw the trap Darius had laid, the way the Persian formation was designed to envelop his smaller force, like the jaws of some primordial beast. The scythed chariots would strike first, sowing chaos in his ranks. Then the cavalry would pour through the gaps, rolling up his flanks while the center pressed forward to complete the destruction. It was a sound plan, the kind that had crushed armies for generations. The young king's response was to do what no one expected. Instead of meeting the Persian formation head-on, he began a curious sideways movement, sliding his entire army toward the right, away from the carefully prepared killing ground. It looked like retreat, like the first sign of panic in the Macedonian ranks. Persian officers began to smile behind their beards, convinced that their enemy was already breaking. But Alexander was not retreating. He was thinking 3 moves ahead, like a chess master facing an amateur. By moving right, he was forcing Darius to extend his own line, stretching it thinner and thinner to maintain contact. The Persian king, terrified of being outflanked, ordered his left wing to match Alexander's movement. Slowly, inexorably, the mighty Persian army began to lose its perfect formation, gaps opening like wounds in its previously solid front. The scythed chariots launched their attack first, thundering across the plain in a display that should have struck terror into any army. The earth shook beneath their wheels, and the air filled with the screams of their drivers and the metallic shriek of their spinning blades. They bore down on the Macedonian phalanx like the very wrath of the gods, unstoppable instruments of destruction. Yet when they struck the Macedonian line, something extraordinary happened. Instead of shattering like glass, the phalanx opened like a flower, creating corridors through which the chariots passed harmlessly. Alexander's men had trained for this moment, practiced the precise timing needed to step aside at the last second, then close ranks behind the passing threat. Most of the chariots thundered through empty air, their deadly blades finding nothing but dust and shadows. Those few that did strike Macedonian soldiers were quickly overwhelmed, their crews dragged down by the very men they had been sent to destroy. The failure of the chariot charge was more than tactical, it was symbolic. The Persians had unveiled their secret weapon, their answer to Macedonian military innovation, and it had proven useless. Worse than useless, it had actually aided the enemy, as the riderless horses careered back through Persian ranks, spreading confusion and fear among troops who had expected to witness a massacre. Darius, watching from his golden chariot, must have felt the first cold touch of doubt. His carefully laid plans were unraveling, his overwhelming advantage in numbers meaning nothing as Alexander continued his maddening sideways dance. The Persian line grew thinner and thinner, stretched beyond its breaking point, gaps appearing where none should exist. It was like watching a master craftsman take apart a complex mechanism, each movement precise and purposeful. Alexander saw his moment and seized it with the instincts of a born killer. Gathering his companion cavalry around him like a spearhead of living steel, he launched himself not at the wings of the Persian army, but directly at its heart. The wedge formation he led was a thing of beauty and terror, a perfectly coordinated instrument of war that had been honed through years of constant campaigning. At its tip rode Alexander himself, his lance leveled, his golden armor making him a target that drew every eye on the battlefield. The collision was like the meeting of tectonic plates, a crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The companions smashed through the Persian front line like a hammer through eggshells, their momentum carrying them deep into the enemy formation. Behind them came the hyperspists, elite infantry who followed their king into the very jaws of death, their short swords working with mechanical precision as they carved a path through the chaos. For a moment that lasted forever, Alexander found himself face to face with the flower of Persian nobility, men whose bloodlines stretched back to the conquest of Babylon, whose ancestors had ruled when Macedonia was nothing but a collection of mountain villages. They fought with the desperate courage of men who knew their world was ending, their curved swords flashing like silver flames in the desert Sunday. But courage alone was not enough against the concentrated fury of the Macedonian assault. The Persian center began to buckle, then crack, then shatter entirely. Units that had stood firm for centuries broke and ran, their ancient standards trampled in the dust by fleeing horses and panicked men. The sight of their comrades in full retreat spread panic through the ranks like wildfire, turning disciplined formations into a mob of terrified individuals thinking only of survival. Darius himself, the King of Kings, master of the world's greatest empire, made the same choice he had made at Issus. Faced with the sight of Alexander cutting through his bodyguard like wheat before the scythe, the Persian monarch turned his chariot and fled. The golden vehicle that had been the symbol of imperial power became a beacon of defeat, its retreat visible to every man on the battlefield. The sight of their king in flight broke the last vestiges of Persian resistance. What had been the greatest army ever assembled dissolved into chaos, a river of humanity flowing eastward in desperate flight. The Macedonians pursued with the ruthless efficiency of wolves, cutting down stragglers and capturing the vast baggage train that had followed the Persian host across half of Asia. But even as his enemies fled before him, Alexander's thoughts were already turning to the future. This was not just a military victory, but the death of an idea, the end of the Persian Empire that had dominated the ancient world for 2 centuries. In its place would rise something new, a fusion of East and West that would reshape civilization itself. The young Macedonian king had not just won a battle, he had conquered the future. The treasures captured at Gaugamela defied description. Gold and silver beyond counting, precious stones that had adorned the palaces of Babylon, silk and spices from the farthest reaches of the known world. But the real prize was far more valuable than material wealth. It was the acknowledgement, written in blood and dust across the plains of Mesopotamia, that Alexander was no longer just a conqueror, but the rightful heir to the greatest empire in history. The shockwaves of Gaugamela rippled across the ancient world like stones thrown into still water. In a single afternoon, Alexander had not merely defeated an army, he had shattered the natural order that had governed civilization for centuries. The Persian Empire, that colossus which had cast its shadow from India to Egypt, lay broken and leaderless, its king a fugitive in his own realm. But Alexander's true genius lay not just in winning battles, but in understanding what victory meant. He didn't simply conquer territories, he transformed them. Greek culture, philosophy, and military tactics spread like wildfire across 3 continents, creating a fusion that would define the ancient world for generations. Cities bearing his name rose from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Afghanistan, each one a monument to the audacity of a young man who dared to dream beyond the horizon. The boy king who had crossed the Hellespont with dreams of glory had become something far greater, the architect of a new world order. His victories proved that with enough courage, intelligence, and sheer bloody-minded determination, even the impossible could be achieved. The ancient world would never be the same, and neither would the very concept of what one man could accomplish when he refused to accept the limits others tried to impose.